In this podcast, we want to explain the idea of the red mentation. From the beginning, the Soviets had in mind a total war in the sense of Karl von Clausewitz. They wanted the total destruction of the past, and not only in Russia, but everywhere in Europe. So their approach was global and not local, but in a subversive way. A war without war, a war in peace, a war within propaganda. As they thought that they were surrounded by hostile capitalists and settlement, they decided to use also the diplomacy as a weapon to divide their enemies. This approach was a new kind of war which was invisible for the people. By this way, they were for the peace, and the war was the fault of their enemies. The red mentation was wearing the role of victim. They had to prove that their revolution was only a victim of the system. They knew that it was a lateral thinking to avoid a direct front line. So they conceived the anti-system and the counter-process. All the others were from them anti-Bolshevik, anti-communist, and counter-revolutionaries. The anti-Cold War period was beginning with the anti and the counter, without mentioning that the red mentation was against mankind and time. The idea is certainly subversive because the Soviets want to do an expansion of their system. But to do this, they wanted to use innocent people, for example, pacifists, and show to everyone that, in fact, they are the victims of the system. So it was a good role for them, and they tried with this method to convince as much people they could that the others, the enemies, were the bad guys, the killers of the world, for example. In fact, it was totally different because they used the idea of peace in a polemological framework. They used the notion of war without never mentioning the total war. They use and they create the notion of operation to avoid the use of strategy, to avoid the use of grand strategy. But at the end of the process, it was only moves of the same grand strategy, a strategy again and again against mankind. So for them, Russia was only the first step. The next step was Europe. So even if now we realize that this period, I mean the anti-Cold War, was in a sense a failure of the diplomacy of free countries, we can see that at the end, the notion of containment was relevant. So they did what they could, but at many levels, they did it in a good way. So it was a good preparation to enter in the Cold War with benefits, with advantages, and we can see it in the field of economy, but also at the end in the space race.